the second year in a row. Coupled with their total domination of the American Le Mans Series, Corvette has proven to be one of the most powerful racing teams on the track today. It's the stuff of legends, one that began 50 years ago. The Corvette, an American original, was nearly born to race. It's a factory-bred vehicle with a heritage and accomplishments in endurance racing, speed records, and competition that is unmatched. In 1960, Corvette first left its mark on the automotive world at Le Mans, securing its very first class victory. It was a time of victory and celebration then, and again today, as we salute 50 years of Corvette. Hello everyone and welcome to the 29th edition of the Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races presented by Dodge, a celebration of the world's greatest cars. I'm Bob Varsha. This year the featured marque is Corvette. Let's get right to our story now with Brock Yates.
Bob, this is unbelievable. The greatest collection of racing Corvettes ever accumulated in the history of the world. A wonderful show. Cannot believe how great it is. And in fact, we've got a star right here in front of us. This is one of 5 Corvette Grand Sports designed by the factory to win not only Le Mans, but the other great World Endurance Championship races. And the great part about this is we're not going to see this car here on display, but later in the show, we're going to see it actually on the racetrack here at Laguna Seca. That's only part of the show. We've got some other great automobiles here to talk about as well. And for that, let's go to my pal, Alan DeCadney.
Brock, Corvette may well be the honored marque here at Monterey, but there's lots of other tasty bits to kid around. Look what I found. A Maserati 300S, the last one built in 1957, and wait till you see what's under the hood here. Just look at that beautiful engine, will you? 6 cylinders, twin overhead cam, 3 triple choke Webers, 275 horsepower. And this, Brock, is the only one that's got a 5-speed gearbox. When Sterling Moss drove this car, he said that it was the best handling sports car from the 50s he ever drove. And that included Jaguars and Aston Martins. And we're going to see this car race a little later in the day. Bob?
All right, thank you, Alan, because that's what it's all about. Priceless cars on track. For example, how about this 1932 Chrysler Regante, all the way from Argentina? A 2-seat Indy car. A 1960 Lola Mark I. All of these cars racing in 14 individual classes based on displacement and age. A 1981 Ferrari 512 BBLM for Ferrari enthusiasts. And perhaps one of the favorites of American fans, a 1969 Boss 302 Trans Am Mustang, formerly driven by Peter Revson. Now we're about to see a great race for 1955 to 59 sports racing cars over 2.5 liters in displacement. And this class will include one of the rarest of the rare, a 1959 Reventlow Scarab. But first, look at what happened earlier in the day. The pre-1931 sports and touring cars were on track. Brock?
Well, this is great fun, Bob. Pre-1931 automobiles included both touring cars, full-fendered cars, and some open-wheel race cars. A wonderful collection, including this one, a 1913 Delta owned by George Wingard, one of the real collectors of these ancient race cars.
They say you can come to these races and see something for everyone, and there's a classic example. Did you know what a Delta was?
Got a riding mechanic in it as well, which is kind of fun because in those days, obviously, they did carry a riding mechanic. But no roll bar in this one, Bob, and you want to be very careful through the corners.
Those classic lines, not unlike a Bugatti. Number 70, running in second place at the time, a 1930 Chrysler V70, driven by Francois Castaigne, former engineering director, I believe, for
Chrysler Corporation. Yeah, appropriate that he, and this is one of the Le Mans cars that competed at Le Mans in the late 1920s and very successfully. Never won there, but they were in the top 5 a number of times. And Francois, very proud of his heritage and his long career with Chrysler.
The car on the road ahead of him is a 1939 Lagonda V12, Richard Morrison at the keyboard. Now look at this tiny thing, a 1935 Austin 7, driven by Rodney Smith. Absolutely fabulous example of a small displacement racing car, and there are a number on the property.
Here's a great car for a Brit to find, an Austin 7 single-seater special, the British equivalent of a United States midget racer. There's a 750cc side valve 4-cylinder engine under there, and I can tell you, it's rare to find one of these. But wait a minute, I found another one. And how about this? Here's the third one. And yet another one. That makes 4 I've found, and there's even a 5th one here that's not even racing. These Austin 7s breed like blue bottles.
Blue bottles? Brock, you got a clue?
I give up. I'm not into British entomology, Bob, but surely Alan knows what he's talking about.
There was Greg Johnson in his 1930 Austin 7. At the end of the race, though, it was Richard Morrison in that 39 Lagonda, which also took the Rolex Award for Outstanding Presentation and Performance in its category. Here's a look at the final results in the class. Elsewhere, Allen's caught up with a prominent enthusiast.
Jay, these Monterey Historics is like a very regular annual affair for you now.
Oh, yeah, I love this. This is the best parking lot in the world.
So you got enough tasty cars of your own, but what's caught your eye this year?
You know, I'm looking at this Cheetah. I love these. When, you know, I think Bill Thomas was the guy, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong, but I remember reading about it in math class, and I had the Hot Rod magazine with the Cheetah, you know, it's under my math book. Well, what do we have here, Mr. Leno? And the teacher grabbed it and shredded it, and I just saw my Cheetah get torn in half. But I've always lusted after these. It's a wonderful car.
Well, it's great to have so much amazing grunt, isn't it, available to your right foot?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just essentially mid-engine car. And it's what I like. It's completely impractical and serves no useful purpose of any kind. There's no trunk. People can't ride in it with you. It's too noisy. It makes noise. It rolls. It explodes. Exactly what I like.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. Jay Leno, lover of both automobiles and motorcycles. The 1955 to 59 sports racing cars are on track. We'll be back to see them in action in a moment. Coverage of the 29th Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races is being brought to you by Dodge. You can take life as it comes, or you can grab life by the horns. And by Merrill Lynch, wealth management, customized planning, sophisticated solutions. Welcome back to Mazda Raceway, Laguna Seca. Lovely example of a Cooper there with the owner's special touch. Brock Yates, what a wonderful place for a kid with an eye for cars.
You're having a look at a little Barclay sports car, having a great time like everybody here as we get ready for the start of this spectacular race with a pair of very rare scarabs up on the pole and outside pole.
This is the 55 to 59 sports racing cars, over 2.5 liters, and these guys are really getting into it. That's Rob Walton out front of the number 16, followed by racing legend Brian Redman and another scarab, and then Paul Brown in a Chaparral and Dirk Layer in a Maserati T61.
And what a special moment it is, Bob, with these two scarabs, two of the rarest front-engine racing cars in the world out here doing combat and being driven very hard. I totally admire the guys that bring cars like this out here and risk them on a racetrack.
Let's not underestimate the job of driving these things. With the age and power of these cars comes great difficulty in handling them. For example, even for a man like Brian Redman in that Scarab.
It's extremely powerful. It's 500 horsepower. Very, very narrow tires, you know, like this. And so you have to be very careful. Also, of course, you sit well back, almost between the rear wheels. So the whole feel of the car is completely different. The more modern, slick-tired, wide-tired, big grip cars. This is very little grip. So you treat it like you're driving almost on ice. Fingers like this, not like this. And you guide it gently. It slides very, very easily, as you may imagine. So you come into a turn, and the car will go already without power on. You know, you put the power on it, and it keeps sliding like this. But if you give it too much power, of course, then you have to back off, give it opposite lock, and try not to leave the road, which is not a good idea.
Well, Brock, despite all of those cautions, I can imagine one or two of us wouldn't mind trading places with Brian Redman right about now.
Unbelievable, Bob. When you think that Lance Raventlow and Chuck Day drove those cars to many, many victories in the late 1950s, they were one of the last of the, as I said, one of the front-engine cars to be obsoleted very shortly thereafter by the mid-engine sports cars from the early 1960s.
Looking down the inside, coming under fire is Redman. That's Paul Brown in that 62 Chaparral 1. Further back, here's Klaus Lehr driving a 1956 Mercedes-Benz SLS Special.
Interesting car, Bob. It's a special that was built in Southern California, driven by Paul O'Shea in a whole lot of races on the West Coast. Interesting automobile.
Let's find out more about it.
Most hot rods out of Southern California are associated with the Bonneville Salt Flats or sprint car racing, but Chuck Porter, who had a body shop down in Hollywood, had always had a dream about Sterling Moss's 300 SLR, with which he won the 1955 Mille Miglia. So in 1957, when a wrecked 300 Gullwing came in to his possession, he decided to build a copy of his favorite car. And this is it. Underneath the bonnet, what have we got? The original slant 6 Mercedes engine with its fuel injection. Quite a machine and a real joy to have here at the Monterey Historics.
So the emphasis on this particular Mercedes-Benz is on the word special.
Absolutely. Like a whole lot of race cars that came out of mostly the Los Angeles base in the late 1950s, hot rod sports cars.
Here's a look at another special. That's James Bartlett in a 1958 Echidna. Ahead of him on the road is the white Devon SS of Steve Young. And also in this skirmish, Stephen Reed in a 1957 Maserati 300S.
So 2 American V8 powered cars and 1 Italian inline 6-cylinder automobile. So that's what we see here in this kind of racing, Bob, both European thoroughbreds and American specials.
And as you saw right there, not afraid to mix it up on the swoops of Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca. That 64 Echidna is an interesting story.
Racing sports cars has always been expensive, but in the 1950s, one way to do it was to take hold of a Chevrolet sedan chassis, shorten it, shoehorn in a fuel-injected Chevrolet engine, 339 cubic inches, and clothe it in this wonderful fiberglass Devon body that you could go and buy for a couple of $100. This is an Echidna, and in 1959, it won the SCCA Nationals Group B Modified. Oh, that's not bad for a homemade car.
Those crossed flags on the hood are kind of reminiscent of the Corvette logo. Corvette, of course, being the honored mark this weekend at the Monterey Historics. And that battle is for 20th place in the class for 55 to 59 sports racing cars.
You know, it's interesting, Bob. No trophies are given out here by Steve Earle and his staff. That's what makes racing unto itself important, but not the overall finish. There's no priority placed on high finishes here. It's the contest among interesting marks that makes Monterey so appealing.
Great engine note from those big American V8s.
This is yet another Echidna, this one being driven by Steve Steers. There are 2 of them in the race. They were sort of East Coast counterparts in a way to the Scarabs. They were specials built up in Minnesota. Ran well in club racing, never were particularly successful at the professional level, but now very collectible automobiles, Bob.
Here's how they're running at the moment. The Scarabs, followed by the Chaparral, a Birdcage Maserati, and a 58 Lister Chevy. We'll be back to the race in just a moment. Welcome back to the 29th Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races presented by Dodge. I'm Bob Varsha with Brock Yates and Alan DeCadenet. There's a look at the Corvette Corral. Corvette at its 50th anniversary year, the honored mark at this year's Monterey Historics. On track, the 1955 to 59 sports racing cars. Brian Redmond now leads, and Rob Walton is under fire for second place from Paul Brown.
And coincidentally, all powered by Corvette small block engines, Bob. And the Chaparral, now sitting in second place, is actually one of 4 Troutman Barnes specials that Hap Sharp and Jim Hall bought and competed under the Chaparral banner. But a very, very good race car. And look at that, driving right underneath Rob. He's doing an excellent job with that car.
Paul Brown takes over second place behind Brian Redmond, and they have lap traffic up ahead. Here's the battle for 5th. Number 7 is Jonathan Fiber in a 1960 Maserati. Up ahead of him, Dirk Layer in number 96. Another Birdcage Maserati in 58 is John Harden in a 1958 Lister Chevy. Oh, and Harden is driving that Lister hard.
Well, John drives this car for Sid Silverman, who's one of the real figures in vintage car racing. Campaigns it all over the United States and drives it very hard.
Just behind him on the road there is Fiber. That's a 1960 Maserati T61, perhaps one of the most identifiable examples of the great Italian brand.
Trust me, every one of the 22 Birdcage Maseratis ever built has a great history. but believe me, this one is special. In this seat, in 1960, sat three of the greatest race drivers of all time. Sterling Moss won a sports car race in Havana, Cuba, the last one ever held there. Then he and Dan Gurney led Sebring for many, many hours until the car broke. And finally, the same year, Carroll Shelby at Riverside won the last great race of his career.
In fact, birdcage Maseratis have turned up in motor racing history in some unusual places. Marvin Panch, the NASCAR great, was testing one for an endurance race at Daytona International Speedway when he crashed, injured himself, could not drive the 500. He was replaced by a young driver who went on to fame as Tiny Lund. Now this is Rich Mason, another great example of the class. Number 6 is a 1956 Corvette SR2, currently running 24th.
This is really one of the very, very special cars in this race, Bob. It was one of the factory-built cars in 1956. It was intended to compete at the international level. And then, of course, was through policy changes, was never raced seriously.
Let's learn more about this particular car.
In 1956, GM styling Supremo Harley Earl had a small problem. His son Jerry wanted a Ferrari. "No way, son," he said, "I'll get you something better than that." This is what he produced. It's the SR2 racing Corvette. They only built 3 of them, and of course, shoehorned in there is the 265 cubic inch engine that they subsequently used. Much of the development on this car was done by the great driver Jim Jeffords, and of course, it was engineered by the one and only Zora Arcos Duntov, whose signature appears right here on the back of the car. Fortunately, he put it there in 1990.
I had the great pleasure of meeting the late Zora Arcos Duntov during the brief revival of the old Nassau Speed Weeks. A great, great interview.
Well, as Alan said, this car was designed for some pretty serious competition. It never made it because there was a ban by the Automobile Manufacturers Association on all Detroit manufacturers to compete in motor racing, and this car was sidelined almost before its development started.
Now back to the leaders in class. Brian Redman, followed by Paul Brown in that Chaparral, and then Rob Walton in that other Scarab.
This is really a special moment, Bob. I'll tell you what, you're never going to see 3 more extraordinary sports racing cars built in the United States competing on the track at the same time. Of course, Lance Reventlow subsidized it, designed and built the Scarabs in Southern California, and Troutman and Barnes built the Chaparral specials here also in Southern California. V8 powered American race cars, and really, really special ones.
Of course, Chaparral is synonymous with the Texan Jim Hall. Let's learn a little more.
Say hello to one of the famous Chaparrals. Actually, there were 4 of these cars built by Troutman and Barnes in Culver City, California in the early 1960s. This car, though, did not belong to Jim Hall of the Chaparral team, but to Harry Hoyer, the Meister Browser Brewing Company in St. Louis. Harry drove this car in a bunch of professional races along with a Scarab, and is very well known in road racing circles, and believe me, is one of the prettiest of the later front-engine race cars of the 1960s.
Well, you could just look at that beautiful car all day long. Beautifully preserved and presented. Final lap now, Brian Redman in the Scarab, coming under fire now from Paul Brown. We said it before, these guys are racing these cars.
I have a lot of admiration, obviously, for Brian, because this is not his specialty. He is from a little bit later era when mid-engine cars, look at this, Brown had to go at him, and Brian handles this front-engine car with his usual skill, but it's not something that he was used to racing during his career.
To the line they come, and Redman in the Scarab manages to hold off Paul Brown in the Chaparral. Rob Walton finishes 3rd, followed by John Mozart in a Lister Chevy. We'll be back. The tradition that is the Corvette. It's all part of this moment in time, brought to you by Rolex. Zora Arcos Duntov, the father of Corvette racing, was a successful racer and designer who fell in love with the Corvette the first time he laid eyes on it in 1953. In '57, Zora and his team of Chevrolet engineers set out to create a different racing machine for the newly organized factory team. In a mere 42 weeks, they created a highly innovative race car that would eventually change the direction of automotive performance. Their vision was to wrap a lightweight magnesium skin over steel tube frame rails. Aluminum heads and a Rochester fuel injection system fed a powerful 283 cubic inch small block V8. Dedi-on rear suspension, a Hallebrand quick change differential, and inboard rear brakes completed the package. Although it looked very similar to the production Corvette, this car was designed for one purpose only: to race. Zora's new creation, the famous SS Corvette, didn't quite live up to its expectations on the track, but it proved to be a highly innovative step for all racing and production cars to come. And of course, a classic part of the Chevrolet tradition being celebrated this weekend in Monterey. There's a '62 Corvette headed for the pre-grid. Let's hear from our runner-up in the last race.
Paul Brown, that was a magnificent performance. It takes a real driver to even keep up with Brian Redman.
Well, it was a real tough race. I did everything I could to try to run with them. I could pull upwind on the braking, but these are some fabulous cars, and it's not worth doing a risk. And traffic hurt me a couple times, and it helped me. And I just gave it everything I had.
Well done you, because I watched the whole race and I was impressed, I have to tell you. Nice job.
Well, the car's a handful. It's really a joy to drive. It's an absolute fabulous piece of machinery.
There we go.
And we'll see plenty more examples of fabulous machinery, such as this Corvette being looked over by a couple of interested fans. Great to see the kids out here at the Monterey Historics. Now let's take a look at another of the earlier races. How about a day when the tires were skinny and the drivers were fat? 1927 through 46 racing cars.
I don't want to get near that one, Bob. I know some of these guys. There's some great old race cars running out here. This one in particular, we saw this earlier in the show. This is a 1932 Chrysler Special being driven by Camillo Steuer and owned by San Francisco enthusiast Martin Swig, who owns a terrific collection of old Chryslers.
How about this 1932 Studebaker, another Indy car driven by Jamie Cleary.
These are two-man cars, carried a riding mechanic, and this is a really special one. This is the Thorne Engineering Special, the Little Six, owned by Joe Freeman out of Boston, and absolutely extraordinary automobile.
The Monterey Cup for engineering excellence coupled with performance was awarded in 2001 to the Sparks Thorne 1938 Indianapolis single-seater car. Art Sparks designed this beautiful Miller-esque six-cylinder engine, which has a centrifugal, well, that's centrifugal for you Americans here, supercharger right there. It's a 3-litre capacity engine because in those days Indy cars had to comply with Grand Prix capacities. And the poor driver sat here, offset to the left. Look at that gearbox right by his right leg, burning his leg during the race. And that thing in the middle there, that's a huge carburetor, which apparently encouraged the driver to keep his foot in it, because if he didn't, when he backed off, there was an enormous vacuum created in that carburetor. Rumor has it, this could cause, well, how shall I put it, some awkward personal damage to the driver.
This sister car, there were two of them built, the Little Six, 3-liter supercharged, a Big Six, 4.5 liters unblown, won the 1946 Indianapolis 500-mile race with George Robeson at the wheel. These cars held the lap record at the Speedway for a number of years.
Checkered flag over Mark Gillies, driving a 1934 ERA. Race winner in the class for 1927 through 46 racing cars. Peter Giddings second in an Alfa Romeo, then John Shirley in another Alfa. Also earlier in the weekend, the 1947 through 55 sports racing cars were on track, a big field.
And they were, Bob, and they were the automobiles that essentially predated the Scarabs and Chaparrals we saw a little bit earlier. These are some of the specials, some European-type cars like the J2X Allard, some Jaguar-powered cars, and an interesting field of specials and European automobiles.
Here's a look at the final results. Winning the class, Charlie Neerberg from Texas in his 54 Lancia. We'll be back. Still to come, the 1955 to 62 GT production cars over 2.5 liters when we return. Welcome back to the 29th Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races. On the Monterey Peninsula, car lovers as far as the eye can see. Every brand represented, each tended with loving care. But the featured marque this weekend, Corvette. And earlier today, a parade of historic Corvettes took to Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca. And among the enthusiasts driving their cars, GM product chief Bob Lutz, and a Corvette Stingray. Plenty of great examples of the Corvette in that category, as there are in our next race, 1956 through 62 GT and production vehicles over 2.5 liters.
This is pretty much a leap back in time, Bob. This could be 1959, 1960, when the SCCA and the Cal Club were running what was called B production races, and it was a contest for the most part between Corvettes, a few Ferraris, a couple of Aston Martins, but it was basically a class dominated in those days by Corvettes, and here we are 40 years later, still dominated by Corvettes.
Joe Freitas in white off to the early lead. You see cars just squealing off the corner, being driven hard here. Oh, we got a guy getting sideways. That's Bob Patterson in black number 9. Looks like maybe the 58 in yellow, Noel Park, got into the back of him. These guys are driving for keeps.
Well, they're always driven for keeps in this kind of racing, and back in the 50s and early 60s, both small block Corvettes, the 283s and 327 Fuelis, they were the training ground for guys like Dan Gurney, Bob Bondurant, and a whole host of great race drivers to come out of the United States.
Right there in second, number 6 has a tale to tell.
Here's a great story for you. In 1957, Paul Reinhardt bought this Corvette brand new and went racing with it in SCCA Production B. By 1961, he was the Pacific Coast champion in that category, and he repeated the honor in 1962. This, by the way, was his idea of a rollover bar. Well, then he sold the car, moved on to other things. But a year or so ago, he was thinking of hanging up his hat, and the last thing he wanted to do before he retired was to drive his old baby in a few motor races. So he went out and he found her, restored her completely the way she was when he first bought her, even to the Union Oil paint finish, because he had a Union Oil station. There's a 283 cubic inch engine in there, of course. Isn't that a wonderful story, though? Just the kind of thing you find at the Monterey Historics.
No question about it. A great story. And Paul Reinhardt is driving it hard. There he is running with number 100, Don Klenke, in a 56 Austin Healey 100, and Bob Reynolds in a 61 Corvette. He started all the way back in 16th. Here he is fighting for 7th. Around Paul Reinhardt he goes as they head for the Andretti hairpin. You know the story of Reinhardt and his crew reunited with the number 6. The question is, are they having any fun?
Everybody seems to be enjoying it. I am really enjoying it.
Great.
As well he should. Paul Reinhardt back at the wheel of the 57 Corvette with which he saw many a checkered flag. We'll be back. Coverage of the 29th Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races is being brought to you by Audi. In technology, performance, and design, our goal remains constant: never follow. And by Merrill Lynch, wealth management, customized planning, sophisticated solutions. Back at Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca, Bob Varsha, Brock Yates, and Alain de Cadenet with you. The late 50s and early 60s GT and production cars are on track. Car number 32 is Jerry Lynch in a 1960 Ferrari 250 SWB. He's currently in 26th, followed by number 54, Len Auerbach, driving a 1960 Aston Martin DB4 GT. These are two very interesting cars.
Back in the early 1960s, when alloyed body short wheelbase Ferrari Berlinettas were able to compete really well with the Corvettes, times have changed. Somehow the Corvettes have found an awful lot more horsepower, whereas the Berlinettas were pretty well maxed out 40 years ago, and owner Jerry Lynch says he's going to have some problems out here today in terms of staying up with the faster vets. But believe me, the differential in value, that's a whole other story. Maybe 20 to 30 to 1 against the Corvette versus this absolutely gorgeous short wheelbase Ferrari.
But Brockett's competition today is not Corvette, it's the Aston Martin DB4 GT.
Aston Martin wanted to go serious international GT racing in 1960, but first they had to homologate their car to get it through the FIA test. That meant building 100 of these, the DB4 GT. 19 of them got bodied by Zagato, which of course turned them into one of the most desirable cars of all time. But this is a regular DB4 GT. It's got a shorter wheelbase, a very skinny, lightweight aluminium body, and of course the heart of the car is its engine. Just have a look at that, will you? A 6-cylinder, it's got 3 twin-choke Weber carburetors, and just look at those 12 plug leads, twin plugs per cylinder, about 270 horsepower. You know, you can never see enough of these DB4 GTs. They are wonderful cars, and I particularly like this one. After all, it is in my favorite color.
And that, of course, would be British racing green. But in silver, you may recognize the Aston Martin that Sean Connery drove in the early James Bond movies. These two right now battling over 26th place. Up ahead, these two Corvettes are jockeying for second.
That's Joe Freitas in the 77, and behind him in the 43 is Ken Epsman. Also, they're both 57 Corvettes, and in those days, Bob, those were small block, fuel-injected cars, and they were hot machines, believe me.
Epsman takes the position over Freitas as they plunge downhill from the trademark corner here at Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca, the corkscrew.
1957 is really the year that the Corvette really came to life in terms of performance. Up until then, they've been 283s and 265 small blocks, but the 283 fuel-injected Corvette in 1957 was the car that really electrified sports car enthusiasts, certainly in America and in some cases in Europe.
Back in 7th place, another beautiful example, this one driven by Steve Earle, organizer of the Monterey Historics. It was once handled by Bob Bondurant.
This is one of the most famous West Coast Corvettes, driven by one of the most famous race drivers of all time, Bob Bondurant, who ran for Charlie Washburn out of Santa Barbara in 1960. Bob must bring back a lot of memories in this car.
This car is a fantastic car, won a lot of races in it. Bob Jenks is the mechanic on it, built the car. He's here this weekend too, and we're just enjoying it. It won a lot of races in this car. It just raced well. It's fun.
Well, earlier in the weekend, Bob Bondurant took this car out for a few celebratory laps, getting acquainted with his own mount. Right now, it's in the hands of Steve Earle, still running 7th.
It's interesting, Bob. You can find Steve in the paddock running the event, but oftentimes he'd be out in a race car. This Corvette, Formula One car, you figure he's out there. He's having fun.
The tradition that is the Corvette, all part of this moment in time, brought to you by Rolex. The 1960 24 Hours of Le Mans witnessed the arrival of an exciting new team of cars from across the Atlantic, the powerful Corvettes. Famed racing entrepreneur and racer Briggs Cunningham was chosen to assemble a team of experienced drivers such as John Fitch and Dick Thompson to lead the charge. With their engines of more than 4 liters displacement, the Corvettes were gridded 1 through 4 at the start of the race. The heavier Corvettes fell behind early as Ferrari jumped to the lead. Among the anxious spectators was legendary Corvette team designer Zora Arkus Duntov. Prospects turned dim as a major rainstorm threatened to slow the Corvette team. In the slick conditions, the number 2 car, piloted by Freddie Windridge, hit the wall and took 2 hours to get back on track. Surprisingly, Corvette was not done. With an amazing night of driving, Fitch moved all the way to 3rd place, but the hard driving took its toll on the engine, which was cooled with whatever was at hand, including ice cream. Miraculously, the Corvettes held on to win their class and capture their first victory at Le Mans.
This success set Corvette on a campaign to win Le Mans overall, which in turn created the great Grand Sport cars a few years later. They were never able to achieve their mission, but they remain some of the greatest automobiles in history.
Back on track with the 1956 through 62 GT and production cars over 2.5 liters displacement. This is the battle for 4th place. Number 69 is a 1962 Corvette driven by Ken Minella. Up ahead of him is a 56 Vet in the hands of Brian Hill. This number 69 was the SCCA B Production Championship winning car in 1964, driven by Frank Dominiani.
Frank Dominiani was not just a good driver, he was also quite a crafty old boy, because in 1962, when he took delivery of this car, it had a 327 cubic inch engine, putting it into SCCA A production racing. But by 1964, that was so dominated, that category, by the 427 cubic inch Cobras, he took out the original engine and slotted in this 283 fuel injected engine, putting it into B production class. So he ended up being the national champion in 1964. Jan Hyde bought this car 32 years ago. He's still racing it today. He much loves it, and it's only had 2 owners.
And we hear that type of story up and down the pit lane. Cars that have been in the hands of their owners for many, many years. Jan Hyde owns the car, but right now it's being driven by Ken Minella.
Interesting that these cars had long careers too, Bob. Oftentimes run for 4 and 5 years in the early 1960s.
Number 25 here is a 1962 Corvette being driven by Harry Yagi back in 24th place.
Harry's driving the optional hardtop, but you can see that these cars carried no fender flares, absolutely stock bodies, clean looking race cars.
Car 25 is a bog standard 1962 327 cubic inch fuel injected Corvette, taken out of the showrooms by Delmo Johnson to the Daytona 24-hour race in 1962. Well, he competed in the race. He was having a real nice time driving round in the car, even had his lunch pack down there on the passenger seat. Well, he pulled a hard-boiled egg out of his lunch pack, and as he took a bite out of it in a left-hand bend, it slipped out of his hand, fell on the floor. Well, didn't worry him. He turned into a right-hand bend, the egg rolled back, he picked it up, ate it, finished the race.
Words to live by in racing. Never try to eat your lunch in a right or left-hand bend. There is Harry. I wonder if he's got his lunch with him now. Running 24th.
Bet he's probably got the air conditioner on, maybe listen to the radio a little bit, because that's the way those cars came almost fully stocked interior-wise.
Here's our current leader in the race. Number 59 is a 1959 Vet driven by Ron Cressy. He goes around, and that could have been expensive.
Well, that's the notorious turn 11, the last corner, decreasing radius left-hander leading on to the finishing straight here at Laguna Seca, and it's caused a lot of problems over the weekend. In fact, over the years, a lot of people have made the same mistake there.
So he drops from first to second. Ken Epsman got by. The other cars that passed Cressy were a lap down.
Well, this is going to be an all Corvette finish, that we can be sure of, Bob, because these cars are very, very potent race cars. As I said earlier, it may be a little stronger than they were when they were originally put on the racetrack, because in the old days, a 300 SL gull wing or a short wheelbase Ferrari, all of which ran in similar classes, could run with the Corvettes. But over the years, they've found some real horsepower. There's your leader. That's Ken Epsman in the number 43 Corvette. Epsman, a very good driver, runs the Trans Am cars and other kinds of vintage automobiles, and he's a very, very good race driver.
Epsman took a quick look back there in turn number 5. He's got about a length of that straightaway between turns 4 and 5 over Cressy.
Ken is one of the big leaders of the vintage Trans Am series. We'll probably see him later in the day out there with his favorite kind of race car, and that is Trans Am automobiles. But boy, he's doing a great job here with this old Corvette. The car looks very stable on the racetrack, Bob. Not a lot of body roll. The car seems to be very well set up for Laguna Seca. Surprisingly well set up, really.
Which is a black art in itself. Not only driving these old cars, but maintaining them and setting them up for performance on the racetrack. One more corner now for Ken Epsman, and he will take the victory in the class for 1956 through 62 GT and production automobiles of 2.5 liters displacement or more. Checkered flag in the air, and he takes the win.
Just like the old days, because Corvettes of this type dominated B production competition. Interesting that this car is very stock. It's very, very much original. Steve Earle insists on that here at the Monterey Historic.
As you saw, Ken Epsman very happy to take the victory, leading a covey of Corvettes. We'll be back. Back at the Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races presented by Dodge. There's something for everyone among the nearly 400 cars here for this event, including this, Brock, a 64 three-wheeler called a Peel, built on the Isle of Man.
And not to be competed here today, I might add, Bob.
Let's go to Alan DeCadenet with the runner-up in our last race.
Ron, I really thought you had that one in the bag.
You weren't the only one. I thought I had the race won, too. I got a little sloppy and took a lazy downshift going into turn 11. into second gear, and I did it a little too soon. The rear end locked up because of the RPMs weren't right with the rear end, and as you saw, the car looped. I was fortunate I wasn't hit. The other fellows went around me, which that's all I cared about at that time. But
Well, it won't happen again, will it?
yeah, you can never tell. I'll think more next time instead of just racing. You have to think too.
Well said. Now while Ron chews over his race, other folks are chewing down some lunch. You know, in Monterey, not all the excitement takes place on the racetrack. There are a number of popular sights to behold, such as the Dodge Heritage display at the paddock, dedicated to the history of the Viper. Among the items on display, the first prototype Viper, known as the White Mule, built in a Jeep facility called the Snake Pit, with a Chrysler 360 and Getrag 6-speed transmission. Here's the Viper GTSR that came in first in class at Le Mans in 1998. And another display of Dodge power is under the tent on the Expo Island, featuring a selection of Chrysler, Dodge, and Jeep cars of today. Dodge has been a longtime supporter of historic racing and of this great event here in Monterey.
And Dodge, more than any other Chrysler division, has supported motor racing for almost 40 years, beginning with the great Hemi campaign in NASCAR back in 1964.
Well, back to racing. Maybe not what we've been enjoying up to now on the track, but now we can take a look at some of the other on-track events that took place earlier. How about the 1947 to 55 sports racing cars under 2 liters displacement with some interesting names at HRG and Aardvark, as well as a Simca Gordini, a Crossley, a Devon Panhard, Cooper Bobtail, and more.
And some of the bigger names, Ferrari, Oscar, and Porsche, all in this race as well, Bob. This is a classic. This is the 1953 Ferrari 166 Mille, a very tiny little car, one of Ferrari's earliest small displacement cars, and being driven beautifully by Jim Fuchs around here.
Here's another rare car. The number 32 is a 1947 Simca Gordini, driven by Carlo Selecki. Ellen had a closer look at it.
A very rare car indeed here at the Monterey Historics is this Simca Gordini single-seater, painted in the Argentine national colors of light blue and yellow because it was sponsored by the YPF Petroleum Company, who sponsored a lot of cars. Juan Manuel Fangio drove this car, and in 1948, that great French driver Jean-Pierre Wimille won the Rosario Grand Prix. It's even got a couple of Argentine mechanics who've come over to look after it.
Olamide Gordini contested in Formula One until the mid-1950s, and it remains a famous but obsolete mark. Really great to have that automobile here. But here are a couple of more famous marks, a Porsche and an Oscar contesting for the lead. That's Robert Baker in the blue 550 Porsche being passed by Bill Perrone in the Oscar MT4. And that is a race for the lead on the final lap, Bob.
Down into turn 11 they went. You're looking at, I have it on good authority, nearly $1 million worth of race cars, but racing is the operative word, as Robert Baker in the blue Porsche could not overcome Bill Perrone in the Oscar at the finish line. And Perrone waves to the crowd, having taken the class victory. Perrone over Baker. Jim Fuchs finished third in his Ferrari 166mm. And looking at these race cars, you could tell it took a lot of courage to drive them then and now. Here are the 1955 through 61 GT and production cars under 2.5 liters displacement. Once again, we see the names Porsche and more out there.
Well, Bob, we're looking at cars that really made sports cars popular in the United States. The great names Triumph, Porsche, this one being driven by Ben Pond, MG. Those are the small displacement, widely produced automobiles that really created the popularity of these kind of automobiles in the early 1950s right through the 60s.
Classic two-seaters like this one. Number 5 is a 1960 MGA driven by Gary Anderson. But up front, the leader in the class, a 1960 Elva Courier Mark I driven by Butch Gilbert, who took the checkered flag, nearly lapping one of his competitors on his run to the checkers. Final results in the 1955 through 61 GT and production cars under 2.5 liters. Gilbert in the Elva Courier, Tide Ebding in a Triumph TR4, and Ned Bacon in a Porsche 356B. Then it was on to the 1955 through 61 sports racing cars under 2.5 liters, including names such as Porsche, Lotus, a Peerless Ambro, Lola, and a Cooper Monaco.
As in those days, it's still dominated by Coventry Climax-powered Lolas, Lotuses, and a few Porsches.
As you see in the results, Patrick Orozco in a Lola beating the similar car of Herb Wettinson, Dan Baker finishing third in a Porsche. Coming up, action including Cobras, Corvettes, and a car called a Bizzarini from Monterey. The tradition that is the Corvette, all part of this moment in time, brought to you by Rolex. Under the direction of Zora Arkus Duntov, the Corvette Racing Group created a number of unofficial racing programs. In 1962, Chevrolet engineers designed the first of the Chevrolet experimental racing vehicles, better known as the CERV-1. The Serve was a purpose-built racing car, designed as a single-seat, open-wheeled mid-engine Bullet. For Arkus Duntov, the Serve was a laboratory on wheels, which allowed him to test and modify his aluminum V8 engine, four-wheel independent suspension system, and inboard brakes. Although Zora had aspirations of entering the Serve-1 in the Indianapolis 500, it was first and foremost a test vehicle, the first of 3 Serves, all created to push the boundaries of Corvette development. Here at Pikes Peak and at other tracks, the car's creators often assisted in the test driving. Welcome back to Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca. Bob Varsha, Brock Yates, and Alan de Cadenet. Folks enjoying themselves and then some here at the Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races presented by Dodge. Now on track, we get to enjoy the 1963 to 66 GT and production cars over 2.5 liters. There's lots of Corvettes out there, but you'll recognize those cars across the front row. Cobras.
And these were the cars, Bob, that broke the domination of Corvette, as we've been speaking about so much in production racing and SCCA and Cal Club competition in the early 60s. Up until then, the Corvettes had been the kings of the road, but then came Carroll Shelby with the Cobras, first with the 289, then with 427, and the Corvette reign was broken. And it's kind of like that as the two cars, the arch rivals, Cobra and Corvette, go at it here as they do right now.
The race leader in number 19 is Jim Click Jr. in a 64 Cobra, followed by number 75 in the white Corvette. That's Terry Goff. He's going to be challenged up the inside by number 44, Ken Ballard, in a 66 Stingray. Classic Cobra versus Corvette action. Zora Arkus Duntov is no longer with us, but Carroll Shelby surely is.
Carroll, 50th anniversary of Corvette. How about that?
I think that it's fabulous that that it came along in the first place, because I would never have had a car to build a Cobra to outrun if it hadn't been for the Corvette. And Zora, God bless his soul, I miss him every day.
Spoken like a true competitor.
I'm sure that Zora would love to be here with Carroll to match wits as these two great cars, Corvette and Cobra, go at it at Laguna Seca, and it brings back tremendous memories for a lot of people that watched these things 30, 40 years ago in exactly the same position. Normally, Cobra leading Corvette.
Off turn 11 they come. Jim Click Jr. leading Ken Ballard. Now to the battle for 12th. Back in the pack, a pair of Shelby GT350s. Speaking of Carroll Shelby, Forrest Strait in a 1966 350 is chasing this man in number 37, Jim Shield, in a 1965 example.
A Shelby GT350, purchased brand new in 1965 by Jim Shield as a street car. He's then gone and raced this car in just about every conceivable event that a four-wheel vehicle can do. Just look at all those plaques in the back for rallycross, sprinting, and road racing. And the most remarkable thing, he's been to the Monterey Historic Races every single year for the last 25 years. Isn't that a great story?
It is that. Now Forrest Strait is now attempting to make a pass, a little bit of a wave, nicely done, as he gets by Jim Shield for the position.
Well, these GT350s were, again, Carroll Shelby versions of the Mustang, and came into production car racing in the middle 60s and really dominated the B production classes that Corvettes had earlier dominated. Of course, they were lighter, they had bigger brakes, and they were very well prepared off-the-shelf race cars, really.
And before the break, we promised you a Bizzarini or two, and we have them. This is the battle for 8th. Number 30 is Gregor Fiskin in a 1965 ISO Bizzarini.
An interesting piece of history, Bob. In the middle 1960s, a lot of Italian and English car makers discovered lightweight V8 pushrod Detroit engines. Of course, the Cobra was a classic example. It was an ACA, became a Cobra. And there were cars like the Iso Grifo, the Gordon Keeble, the Bizzarini, all carried lightweight small block Chevys in Italian bodies.
Giotto Bizzarini was well known as the designer of Ferrari's fabulous GTO car, but in 1963 he fell out with Ferrari. He was recruited by Renzo Rivolta to design a car that could beat the Ferraris. This is it, the ISO Bizzarini. This one first saw the light of day at the Turin Motor Show in 1963. It's the prototype, and it was used as a practice car at Le Mans in 1964. This is the 1965 Le Mans car. It's got a 350 short block Chevy engine in there, giving about 400 and odd horsepower, independent rear suspension, and it's going to be driven here by, would you believe, my neighbor in London, Gregor Fiskin. And I can tell you, 2 Bizzarinis in the race, well worth watching.
Well, there were lightweight bodied cars, Bob, and had big, strong, torquey engines in them, but the Bizzarini guys never really had the backing of a Ferrari or a Maserati to be able to really campaign these cars effectively at Le Mans.
We saw Gregor Fiskin in the number 30. This is Dirk Lair in the number 2 car, being chased for 5th place by a 1963 Cobra in the hands of Fred Galloway. As that battle continues, we'll take a break and return in a moment. Welcome back to Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca, where Corvette is the featured marque in the 29th edition of the Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races presented by Dodge. On track, great action. The battle for 2nd place in this category for GT and production cars from the early 60s. Jim Click in number 19, Ken Ballard number 44, Terry Goffin number 75.
And the 2 Corvettes are really going at it down into the corner there, and it looks like the coupe of Ken Ballard is going to get underneath and take a shot at the lead. Look at this. He goes right by Jim Click. So he came from 3rd, basically, right through the pack to take over the lead. Great move by old Ken Ballard.
And more aggressive race driving in these historic cars.
So suddenly Jim Click is a Cobra insert into a Corvette sandwich here with that Cobra. He had the lead for quite a while, but right now Ballard seems to be opening out a bit.
Through turn 5 and heading up to 6, climbing the hill to the corkscrew. It's like everybody took a deep breath there. Good battles going on further back in the pack as well. Let's go find one. For 22nd place, car number 6 in black. That's Susan Armstrong, one of a number of female enthusiasts out here handling these big cars. That's a 63 Corvette Z06. Susan's quite a competitor and part of a family of racers here in Monterey.
Vintage motor racing produces some great stories, as we all know. The Armstrong family race together, but they also race against each other. Sue Armstrong is racing her 1963 Z06 car number 6 against her son-in-law Steve Anderson in a 1963 Corvette number 5. Now here's an interesting situation for you. If you beat your mother-in-law out too often on the racetrack, how can she get even with you? Interesting, huh? Oh, and by the way, how do the Armstrongs keep it in the family? Well, the granddaughter's just cleaning the car for the time being, but she tells me her feet are just a few inches away from the pedals. Ooh-wee.
I couldn't imagine a better incentive for a young enthusiast than the idea of getting behind the wheel of one of these great cars. Right now, the son-in-law, Steve Anderson, right there, very brave in the number 563 Corvette Stingray. He's running at 18th place. He's ahead of his mother-in-law. There may be a reckoning when this one's over.
Well, Steve's at the wheel of one of the most famous Corvette models of all time. That, of course, is the 1963 split-window coupe that is still one of the most valuable and desirable Corvettes of all time.
Well, we've got a full-course caution packing up behind the pace car, and there's the reason right there, it appears. The number 2 63 Bizzarini, driven by Dirk Layer, got sideways while running in 5th. Here's a look.
Well, he came off that right-hander leading behind the pits and just lost it looks like, Bob, and fortunately doesn't look as if he banged the automobile up too badly, although he might have stuffed it into the wall.
I think he just caught the end of the tires but kicked up a large cloud of dust. Now, while we're under caution, we want to take a look at car number 3 right there in your picture. Another split window coupe and a very rare Z06 Stingray. It's in the hands of Tom McIntyre this weekend, and it is another interesting piece.
Oh, Bob, here it is in the flesh, one of the original 6 lightweight Z06 Corvette Stingrays, 1963. Built strictly for automobile racing by Bill Mitchell and Zora Arkustuntoff, and carrying such names as Junior Johnson, Mickey Thompson. And behind it here, one of the great mystery motors, the Porcupine Head 427, that was installed in this car originally by a man named Smokey Unick. So here we have it, one of the great race cars in American automobile racing history, and associated with it 3 and 4 of the greatest names in racing.
Just another great story from the Monterey Historics. We'll take the checkered flag under caution. And so here are the results in the 1963 through 66 GT and production car race. Cars with more than 2.5 liters of displacement. It'll be the 44 Corvette Stingray of Ken Ballard over Jim Click Jr. in his 64 Cobra and Terry Goff in a 65 Corvette. A little later in the program, the real heavy metal, America's oldest active road racing series, Trans Am Thunder at Monterey. The tradition that is the Corvette, all part of this moment in time, brought to you by Rolex. The 1987 Monterey Historics was the site of a legendary reunion when Zora Arkustuntoff, the father of the Corvette racing program, was reunited with some of his most famous creations on the racetrack.
When the car is stationary, it brings lots of memories. When I try to drive it,
members of Zora's original engineering team, such as Lou Cutito, were on hand for the festivities. Cutito was assigned the task of getting the famous Corvette SS race ready for Monterey. It proved to be an emotional undertaking.
Those are great feelings for me. You know, when you spend 30, almost 40 years working on automobiles, and then you come to something like this, it's hard for me to tell you how I feel.
Memorable moments in time. We come to expect them at Monterey. And new memories being minted by the moment this weekend at the 29th edition of the Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races. Our most recent race has rolled back to the paddock. Alan DeCadenet is standing by with the winner, Ken Ballard.
You saw the checkered flag first, which is what it's all about.
I had a great day today. I can't explain it. It just, the car was hooked up. We'd practiced all week. We'd had some problems with everything you can imagine. And it just, in the final analysis, we just were able to stay ahead of the Fords. And usually they beat us, but not today, because today is Corvette's day.
See, that couldn't be better. 50th anniversary and a win.
You bet, Alan.
Thanks, Alan. Now, one of the most popular spots in the paddock is the Rolex Moment in Time tent. On display are some great historic cars, including Eddie Kuzma's 1951 Agajanian Special, which won the Indianapolis 500 in 1952, among 6 appearances, in which it was driven by legends such as Ruttman, Tony Bettenhausen, and Roger Ward. The 2001 Rolex Daytona 24-hour winner is this powerful Corvette C5R. Similar models won their class at Sebring and Le Mans in 2002. And here's the 1967 Ford GT40 Mark IV, the car that Dan Gurney and A.J. Foyt drove to victory at Le Mans. History lives on display in the Rolex Moments in Time tent.
Well, here's one of the most crowded and interesting areas in the whole paddock area at Laguna Seca. It's the BMW display of racing cars, and I'm with Jim McDonald, the VP Marketing of BMW North America. And Jim, I'm sure it's exciting for you guys to come here and see the attention paid to these race cars.
Without a doubt, it's so wonderful to see so many people with enthusiasm that really want to see the great old cars and are spending the whole weekend here.
Jim, tell me a little bit about a mobile tradition, which I understand is the sort of theme of your historic interest in historic racing cars.
Right. We think it's important that people know that BMW has a wonderful living history of our racing achievements. And because of that, we try and bring out the historic cars so that people can see them, hopefully on the track, but on as many occasions as they can.
Well, of course, you've got one of the greatest names in motor racing, Brian Redman, here, representing the race cars on the track, as he did so successfully during his active career. And I've talked to Brian and know him well, and I know he has a really special place in his heart for BMW.
Well, we certainly can tell that. I was at a dinner where he was speaking last night, but we think it's great to have the historic car and the actual driver whenever is possible to try and recreate the feeling of the actual race that was won.
Well, it's a delight to be here, and I can't wait to see these race cars out in the track. It's a special moment for all of us.
We saw Brian Redman and current BMW race team owner Tom Milner consulting on car setup. That car, by the way, is in this race for 1966 through 81 FIA Group 4, 5, 6, and IMSA cars, including Ford GT40s, Lola T70s, Alfa Romeo T33s, Chevrons, Porsches, BMWs, and Ferraris. And once again, tight racing down there in the hairpin as Phil Dagrapon jumps out front in a Porsche 908.
I know I keep saying that, guess what, I found one of my all-time favorite cars, but this really is one of my all-time favorite cars. It's a 1970 Porsche 908/3. This is the car that Brian Redman, when he first saw it, asked the designer, hey, where do my legs go? He said, well, they hang out over the front axle, which wasn't too cool. Van Lennep and Marque won Le Mans in a Porsche 917 in 1971, but they also got to race one of these as well. And I drove one down in Kailami at the 9 Hours. A fabulous, fabulous little car, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it race. Actually, the real reason I want to show you this car is because the guy who owns it says I can drive it for him one day. Yay!
I'd pay to watch that. This was the battle for second between Todd Morisi and the number 72, 1981 Ferrari 512 BBLM, and Bruce Canepa in the number 12, 1979 Porsche 935.
I'll tell you what, Bob, high marks to Todd Morisi, because that big 512 is a heavier, more cumbersome race car, and Canepa is a good driver, and he's got a very steamy little 935 Porsche that is unable to get by Todd. It's a very hard car to drive on this particular race course, especially compared to this car, which is absolutely perfect. That's a Chevron B19 that won it. Randall Smith, very light, very powerful little sports racing car.
And he picks up the victory. Randall Smith and his Chevron B19 over Morisi's Ferrari, Canepa's Porsche, Dagrapon in that Porsche 908 that Alan loved so much, and Robert Gregory in a 1970 Chevron B16. Coverage of the 29th Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races is being brought to you by Rolex. Rolex, the watch of champions the world over. And by Dodge. You can take life as it comes, or you can grab life by the horns. Back at Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca, plenty of souvenirs on hand and lots of customers for them. One of the most popular vintage auto racing events the world over. And, of course, it helps to have Daddy around to give you a help back to the paddock at the end of the day. Earlier in the weekend, this was the race for 1957 to 65 Formula cars, meaning Formula One, Formula Two, Formula Junior, and so on. Lotus, Tarashis, Coopers, Polinskis, lots of unfamiliar names.
Well, this is a real mixed bag, Bob. Everything from Formula One cars to some American specials.
There's number 11. That's a 1962 Holinsky in the hands of Dave Olson. Currently running in 17th place. Classic example of low-slung, very small, tight, and driver-forward race cars.
Another trip down memory lane here at Laguna Seca. I remember when this car was built in upstate New York by Dick Kalinsky, a sprint car builder for a Corvette driver by the name of Jerry Brownrout. He wanted to run this car in the USAC Intercontinental Formula Series for rear-engine tubular chassis style race cars, open wheel. Unfortunately, that series died almost before it got underway, and in fact, the Kalinsky Engineering Special didn't race much, but it's come back, totally restored here at the Historics, and a beautiful example of a great race car that didn't go very far on the racetrack.
Well, it's going on the racetrack right now. Dave Olson giving it a ride down through the corkscrew here at Mazda Raceway, Laguna Seca.
Well, here's another example of a wonderful little race car that was very quickly obsoleted. This is the Stangolini Formula Junior that appeared in the late 1950s, designed and built in Italy with a Fiat-powered production-based engine. It was a very popular race car, along with Terascis and other types of front-engine Formula Juniors. But it was very quickly obsoleted by the Lotus 20, this number 27 car being driven by Gil Nickel, actually losing the lead right there to the number 88 Formula One car of Tom Claridge, two Lotuses.
And these two went back and forth, lap after lap. On lap number 8, Nickel takes the lead back. Then on lap 9, Claridge will come up the hill to get him. Watch him light up that left front as they head for turn number 6.
These cars looked exactly alike, but in fact they were totally different. The number 88 car of Tom Claridge is a Formula One car, 1.5-liter Coventry Climax, whereas Nickel's car carries a Ford 105E production-based engine of a much smaller displacement, 1,100 cc's, but right now he's staying ahead of the Formula One car.
Claridge takes the victory in a drag race, a great finish for the 1957 to 65 Formula cars. Here's the final results. Tom Claridge over Gil Nickel, with Don Orozco finishing third, all in various iterations of the classic Lotus. Now let's check out another race, the 1966 through 72 GT and production cars, including Corvette Grand Sport, Cobra 427. Boy, going from the tiny to the heavy metal. And one of the heaviest of all is car number 44, a 1968 Corvette L88. Another spectacular example of the Corvette Marque.
Everybody remembers that the late great John Frankenheimer movie Grand Prix, filmed in 1966. Well, James Garner was so enthralled at playing the part of a race car driver, he wanted to become a real one. So he got his mate Dick Gullstrand and Bob Bondurant to teach him what to do. They did a great job. In 1968, Garner went to General Motors and bought 3 brand new L88 Corvettes. All 3 of them are here at the Monterey Historics, and this car, number 44, will be driven by his old mate, Dick Gullstrand.
I keep finding myself turning back to movie history to go to automotive history here at the Monterey Historic Automobile Races. Dick Gullstrand giving it a ride as they head up the hill. And here's number 11. This is a 69 Corvette L88. Tony DiLorenzo going by John Goodman, also in a 69 Corvette. L88 signifies the engine, the Chevy Big Block.
One of the really cool things about the Rolex Monterey Historics is you wander through the paddock area and you can find sort of a history lesson of all kinds of race cars. In this particular one, this is Tony DiLorenzo's incredible L88 Corvette of the late 60s and early 70s. They're getting ready with this car, the Owens Corning fiberglass Corvette L88. Won its class at Sebring in 1960. Also was an A production champion in the SCCA competition. This car was run both with a fiberglass hardtop on it for international competition and also as a roadster when they ran it at SCCA production competition. Incredible big race car, beautifully prepared. The guys are getting ready to take it on a racetrack, and Tony drove it then, driving it today.
We see it so often here at the Monterey Historic Races. Great drivers reunited with great race cars. There is Tony on track in his big block Corvette.
This perhaps was the ultimate example of a Corvette race car, excluding the current C5Rs. This Grand Sport Corvette, being driven here by Rob Walton out in the lead, was one of 5 specially built race cars. 377 cubic inch fuel injected engines, fabulous race cars, designed specifically to win at Le Mans, never achieved that goal.
But they won here. That example in the hand of Rob Walton. Finishing second, Randy Peterson. Third, Tom Armstrong. Early this weekend, we also saw the class for 1959 through 66 sports racing cars. Once again, Lotus, Brabham, plus Abarth and Elva. Jumping into the lead early on, the 1963 Lotus 23B of Joel Mata, and he would hold that lead to the checkered flag, taking the victory. Finishing second was Tom Burns in his 64 Brabham BT8, followed by Barry Williams in a 1960 Cooper Monaco. And then another of the rare cars you'll find only here at Monterey, a 1964 Genie Mark 10 with Mike Blackie. After a break, the rumble of Trans Am. American Thunder will be on track in a moment. The tradition that is the Corvette, all part of this moment in time, brought to you by Rolex. In 1953, a new car startled attendees at the GM Motorama in New York City, the Corvette. That very same vehicle, the EX122, is on display here in Monterey. This car is the experimental pre-production prototype, the oldest known Corvette. Originally built in late 1952, it had a 6-cylinder engine and a simple white paint scheme. After Motorama, Chevy engineers decided to beef up their new creation by adding a powerful V8 engine and a sporty new red paint job, making it the first V8-powered Vette on the road, then and today, 50 years later. Well, that's just one of many historic Corvettes on display here as the Marque celebrates its 50th anniversary as the featured Marque at the 29th Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races. Corvette sponsored a lunch this weekend, generally rolling out the red carpet for owners and fans of the Corvette brand. And they put up a big tent for the general public with lots of cool stuff in it, including Corvette displays of history and performance. And there we ran into the man in charge of design and production, Bob Lutz of General Motors Corporation, who had some thoughts on the most recent edition of the Corvette tradition.
The C5 has matured to being such an excellent car, whether it's structure, ride, handling, performance, slickness of the gearbox, and reliability. You know, it's the most reliable sports car in the world. And I think it's a good halo for GM. And I think it shows that if you can deliver a really great price-performance relationship, it works in any product category.
And with that, it's time for the most anticipated race of the weekend for 1966 through 72 historic Trans Am cars, Camaros, Boss 302 Mustangs, Javelins, Dodge Challengers, and BMWs.
Truly the most spectacular racing series probably ever produced on these shores, Bob. I cannot tell you the kind of excitement these things generate wherever they race. And this, of course, is the best accumulation of these cars ever that comes together each year at Monterey. Right now, Ken Effman in one of the Sam Posey Caldwell Dodge Challengers out front, but right behind him a couple of Camaros and the Boss 302 Mustang, driven by Jamie Mazzata. Those two cars in their original form, driven by Parnelli Jones and George Fulmer.
There's the 99 of John Hillenbrand. He and Michael Eisenberg in the 23, driving a pair of Camaros. Brock, it's hard to look at these cars going through turn 5 and up the hill without thinking of those great names that you mentioned before. Fulmer and Parnelli Jones and Sam Posey.
Mark Donahue, Peter Revson, the list goes on. I ran this series in 1972 in a Camaro, and I can remember being blown off by all those guys. And just an incredible experience to be out there with perhaps the most competitive collection of race drivers ever assembled on these shores.
Jamie Mazzata already caught by number 9 Jim Haig for second place. Now he comes under fire from John Hillenbrand in the white number 99 for third. And just look at that collection streaming down the corkscrew.
Mostly 5-liter American production-based cars, but mixed in there some Alphas and some BMWs running in the under 2.5-liter class.
We had a quick look at a BMW 2002 there as we pick up the battle once again between Mazzata and Hildebrand for third. Off the corner comes the race leader.
I'll tell you what, he's going to be challenged here as they go down into turn 1 by the Camaro. Look at, is he going to get under Efren? He's got the right line. Can Efren get by him? No. Ken has to back off, so we got a new leader.
Jim Haig. That beautiful 69 Camaro with a pedigree that goes back to Roger Penske and the aforementioned Mark Donohue. For his part, Ken Epsman in that beautiful lime green Dodge Challenger number 77 likes the way his car is running this weekend.
This car actually does pretty well around here. When the car was built, it was over acid dipped, and so along the way we welded up the cracks and the seams, and the car works real well from the corkscrew down to turn 11. Seems like I can pick up some speed there on some of the other guys. However, coming off turn 11, I'm a little slow because I got the wrong gearing in second gear, and I lose a little bit starting on the straightaway, but can catch them down toward the end.
Well, keep in mind that these cars, the lead 3 cars, Bob, are not exactly home built. The Roger Penske's cars are heavily supported by General Motors. Dodge and Chrysler Corporation supported the Caldwell Posey car, and of course the car being driven in third place by Mazzata was built by Bud Moore with major help from Ford Motor Company.
The race leader is Jim Haig in his 69 ex-Penske Camaro, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races. This is the Trans Am event. And there is Jamie Mazzata in his Boss 302 Mustang taking second place away from Ken Epsman in his 1970 Dodge Challenger. So our pole sitter has dropped back to third. Meanwhile, back in 26th, driving a 1970 BMW 2002 Ti, this is Danica Patrick, just 20 years of age, making her way up the racing ranks. We thought it'd be interesting to hear what it's like to drive a car older than she is.
This car doesn't have power steering. That's one of the things. The brakes aren't probably what kind of brakes they are today. It's just, it doesn't handle quite like an open wheel car, but it rolls and it doesn't stop very well and it doesn't have a lot of grip, but it's what they drove back in the day, so it's kind of neat to be able to feel what that was like, and be able to accept what it is today and how much actual downforce and grip and power there is. So it's an interesting contrast.
Well, Danica is a terrific young star on the horizon. Finished second in last year's British Formula Ford Festival. Now working under contract with kart team owner Bobby Rahal.
Meanwhile, the battle for second place continues as Ken Epsman tries to make his way back to where he started, which was on the pole in this race. But right now, he still sits in third place. But that lead pack of cars is breaking away from the rest of the field.
And this is where Epsman says he hurts the most. Off of turn 11 and the drag race down into turn 2. Let's see if he can close up under braking on the 2 cars ahead of him, Jim Haig in that number 9 Camaro and Jamie Mazzata in the Boss 302 Mustang. Well, instead we get a battle for the lead between Mazzata and Haig.
Classic Ford versus Chevy battle here as Mazzata holds onto it, coming back onto the straight behind the pits. And suddenly the Ford fans are leaping out of their seats.
And that 4th place Camaro of John Hildebrand is drawing ever closer, but we want to drop back to 5th. And another interesting piece. There is the number 2 81 in the hands of Tom Georgalos. Another very, very interesting car, and I'll bet it has some more Penske heritage.
All of the Trans Am cars here in the paddock area at Laguna Seca have great histories, but I'm not sure any of them has a more storied past than this AMC Javelin. 1970, it was run by Mark Donohue under the Roger Penske colors. And then in 1971 and 72, it was turned over to the Roy Woods racing team, where guys like Vic Elford and Peter Rebson drove the car. And then in 1972, it was carried to the Trans Am national championship by George Foamer. So this race car not only owned by two of the best racing teams in the business, but driven by four of the finest race drivers in history. Great, great story here.
It is that. Roy Woods Racing. I wonder if our old colleague David Hobbs maybe had a turn of the wheel in that machine. Here is Tom coming down the hill. Up ahead of him, we got a good battle for third. That's John Hildebrand, has gotten by Ken Epsman for the spot. But Epsman is right there on his bumper. Now this is turn 11. This is where Epsman likes to make his moves, and he does.
The Challenger that Sam Posey raced, that car, the number 77, was noted to have a lot of power, Bob, but was bigger and heavier and had a quite a bit more frontal area, as you can see, than the Camaros of the same era. But they were very competitive race cars in the single season that they competed.
Now up ahead, there is Haig battling Mazzotta for the lead, and Haig takes it back.
So the number 9 car, remember Penske's cars normally carried number 6, but this was a team car with the alternate at number 9.
Now back in 21st place, we find John Norman, number 58, in a 1971 Alfa Romeo GTV. An example of the smaller class for Trans Am cars that ran for many years under Sports Car Club of America sanction.
Running in the up to 2-litre category of the Trans Am race today is John Norman's 1971 Alfa Romeo GTV. A pretty stock car for the time. Has a 2-litre, 4-cylinder twin overhead camshaft engine, two double-choke Weber carburetors, giving about 185 to 190 horsepower. But quite a sophisticated car for the time. Have a look at those brakes down there. 4-pot Lockheed calipers, ventilated discs, all in a car that weighs virtually nothing and handles beautifully. So it's hardly surprising they were so successful in their day.
I'm surprised Ellen called it an engine and not a lump, which is often his fashion. Now, while we were enjoying John Norman's Alfa, Ken Epsman used the power of that Challenger down to turn 11 to pass Jim Haig for the race lead.
So Epsman back out front where he started, and let's see if Mazzotta can challenge for second place. He does. Down into the left-hander at the bottom of the hill, he takes over second. So suddenly it's kind of back in order. Look at this. Hildebrand challenges on the outside. He will take over third place.
And Tom Georgalos is also there in that 71 Javelin. Something for everyone in this race. Epsman in the Challenger, Mazzotta in the Mustang, Georgalos in the Javelin, Haig in a Camaro. We'll be back. Promotional consideration provided for and a fee paid by the picturesque Bernardus Lodge, one of the Monterey Peninsula's finest establishments. Welcome back to the Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races, and we have a real race going on here for vintage Trans Am cars. Number 3, Bruce Canepa, in 1970 AMC Javelin, battling right here for 15th place with Nick DeVitus in his 68 Mustang.
Two completely different cars here, Bob. Considerable, 4 years difference in technology. The Javelin, as we said earlier, had a lot of pedigree there as Canepa gets a little bit sideways coming down off the hill. But here is a Boss 302 Mustang with the name Peter Revson mounted on the door. Fantastic race car again, entered by Carroll Shelby.
This is Gary Underwood driving. Once again, another classic example of Carroll Shelby's handiwork.
I guess we remember Carroll Shelby and Shelby American as being involved with Cobras, but in fact in 1969 they were actively involved in the Trans Am series. This particular car, driven by Peter Revson, was one of 4 that Shelby put together for that season, now immaculately restored by Gary Underwood here at Monterey. But this automobile is a perfect example of the Boss 302s that were so dominant after they were turned over to Bud Moore and his team, and of course Parnelli Jones and George Foamer carried them to great success. But in this particular livery, this is Shelby American's colors.
And now the car is in the hands of Gary Underwood, battling with Dan Walters in his 1970 Camaro for 10th place. Down the corkscrew they come with that unmistakable deep throaty roar of big V8 horsepower. Up front, we still have a train. 4 cars long with 2 laps to go. Mazada, Haig, Epsman, and Hildebrand headed for turn 5. Now Haig will attack down the inside while Hildebrand does the same on Epsman for third.
So we got musical chairs here, Bob, and this outcome is far from settled as now we've got a Camaro out front.
Up the hill they go one more time.
I wonder if the AMC Javelin can get out front. That's the only one of the 3 Marques that hasn't had the lead here.
Boy, this is great driving. Keep in mind, as we heard earlier, these cars aren't like racing contemporary technology, so they have to be handled very carefully, and yet here they are, nose to tail, just a couple of car lengths between each.
Notice there's no fender flares, no big wide tires on these things, no ground effects. These are basically stock platform cars with just a roll cage in them, and not many modifications were allowed to the drivetrain, really. So they were very close to production-based automobiles in the classic days of the Trans Am.
Ooh, Haig getting squirrely. 99 is off the course.
Almost caught the wall there as he comes back on.
I was about to say tire technology has come a long way since these cars were in their heyday. White flag waves last lap.
Although it worked pretty well. They worked pretty well on the dirt there, Bob, I must say.
Haig likes a nice wide line there in turn 2. Almost too wide there. Mazada right there looking to retake the lead. Epsman in third, Hildebrand in fourth after that off-road excursion down in 11.
That's what makes these cars great. Skinny tires, no ground effects. You see them slide and work their way through the corners. They're challenging cars to drive, and they're great fun to watch.
Let's see what happens as they race down into turn 5 and head up the hill for the final time here at Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca.
Camaro, Mustang, Challenger, the big 3, all competing for victory here at Laguna Seca.
Well, the brand has dropped slightly off the pace. It's down to these 3.
Looks like Mazada's going to take a shot at him up on top of the hill as they head down into the corkscrew.
Looked like Epsman was going to follow him for a moment, but Haig was able to reinsert that Camaro between them. Oh, look how close they are.
So, Mazada heads down the hill with a very tight lead, and let's see if Epsman can make an assault on him as they head down to turn 11.
Oh, here comes Haig looking one side. Mazada, tactical drift to the outside, lines up for the corner. 1 corner to go.
And Haig's going to try him on the outside. I don't think that's going to work. Mazada holds it tight on the inside. Look at this, going to be a drag race to the finish.
Epsman there as well. Mazada, Haig, Mazada, Haig. Jim Haig takes the win by about 1.5 feet over Mazada.
Great race and a great final turn. Haig did a great job way on the outside to get around Mazada. That was an excellent pass.
Great job all around. Final results, Jim Haig takes the win over Mazada and Epsman. We'll be right back. Coverage of the 29th Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races presented by Dodge is being brought to you by Merrill Lynch. Wealth management, customer planning, sophisticated solutions. And by Rolex. Rolex, the watch of champions the world over. Here's another look at that terrific finish between Jim Haig and Jamie Mazada in our Trans Am race. Let's hear what the winner thought of it.
Oh, I went on the outside. He decided to take the inside. I took the outside, figured he'd go wide and I go on the inside, but he didn't do that. He gave me room on the outside and went ahead and did the drag race thing. So 2 4s are better than 1, I guess.
Final results of the Trans Am class, Jim Haig and his Camaro over Jamie Mazada's Mustang. In 4th place, John Hildebrand wins the Rolex Award for outstanding presentation and performance in the category. Here's 2nd place, Jamie Mazada.
I was on the inside, so I got a little bit of a push, and it dropped my RPM, so I think he got me a little bit there, and then when I shifted, I spun the tires, and I think Jimmy got that win by 1/2 car or so. But he's a heck of a driver, and it was a lot of fun. I think I rang the old Bud Moore car out all I could.
He did that, and so the 29th Rolex Monterey Historic Automobile Races come to a conclusion and a great weekend for Corvette on the Marque's 50th anniversary. Brock Yates, your final thoughts.
Bob, there's no place in the world where you'll find more unique automobiles than at the Monterey Historics, especially the versions of both American cars and European cars. They're beautiful, they're perfectly preserved. They're races they raced when they were on the racetrack as far back as the pre-World War I days. It's a spectacular place. I recommend everybody see this event at least once in their lifetimes.
And that, of course, is without getting into the charms of California's beautiful Monterey Peninsula. I'm Bob Varsha for Brock Yates and Alan DeCadene. Thanks for joining us here on Speed Channel for the Monterey Historics, a car show like no other. So long, everyone.